There are legends of the deep. Ancient and elusive, they are the keepers of balance in our oceans. Hammer, angel, great white, tiger, manta. Refined over millions of years, their powers are unique. They are super sharks. Together, they ensure the stability of our world's life support. The oceans. Our oceans need super sharks. We need them, and they need our help. Assemble the super sharks and help them save our seas.
Sharks and rays. They are ancient, enigmatic, misunderstood, and essential to our oceans. But these important animals are under immense pressure. As the Save Our Seas Foundation, we're here to help. Through supporting research, conservation, and education, we work to ensure a future for sharks and rays. The Save Our Seas Foundation. Together, we can make a difference.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to tonight's Save Our Seas Foundation Distinguished Speaker Series. We're so happy to have you come back and continue on in tonight's installment of the series. My name is Lance. I'm the Director of Environmental Sustainability here at the Museum of Discovery and Science. And we want to start the evening just saying thank you to the Save Our Seas Foundation for supporting this program and bringing it to you guys tonight. Tonight we are joined by yet another shark researcher, Dr. Brendan Talwar, hailing from the Scripps Institute for Oceanography out in California. You're going to be talking tonight all about silky sharks, pelagic, open ocean, beautiful sharks, and about his research. But before we do that, just a quick thing about who we are and a little bit about what we do. We are part of the Museum of Discovery and Science in Fort Lauderdale, Florida. Our mission is to connect people to inspiring science. And we do that through 4 different pillars: health and wellness education, early childhood education, physical science education, but then also environmental sustainability. And tonight, we're really stretching that environmental sustainability muscle tonight and connecting you to an inspiring scientist that can tell us all about some wondrous ocean-related topics. So if you ever find yourself in town, we would love to have you stop on by to the museum. Again, tonight, Dr. Brendan Talwar will be joining us. Growing up in Kentucky, Brendan's interest in marine biology developed through years of fishing in the bluegrass estate in various creeks, as well as fishing in seagrass beds near Pensacola Beach. As he learned more about the threats facing our ocean, he became more passionate about ocean conservation. Brendan received his master's in biology from Florida State University. His master's research focused on post-release mortality of deep sea bycatch species. So like predicting how often animals caught by accident suffer mortality when they are thrown back alive. After earning his master's degree, Brendan headed to Washington, D.C. to work in the Marine Mammal Commission as part of his NOAA Sea Grant NOS Fellowship. Following his fellowship, he landed at Cape Eleuthera Institute as a research associate, where he spent time conducting research and using his findings to teach students there. Brendan recently completed his PhD in biological sciences through Florida International University. Congratulations, Brendan. Dr. Talwar, we should say. Brendan's PhD research focused on ecology of silky sharks, and we'll spend part of tonight's talk speaking on these amazing animals, but these amazing but mysterious open ocean predators. Brendan is currently working as a postdoctoral scholar with the Scripps Institute in the Simmons Lab at Scripps Institute of Oceanography in San Diego, and with the Nature Conservancy. So, Brendan, welcome tonight. We're happy to have you.
Thanks, Lance. Great to be here.
Yeah, I'm excited to hear about your research with silkies and what you're up to at the Scripps Institute. There's always great science happening out there. So just a few little housekeeping things for everyone that's joining us tonight. If you have any questions for Brendan, please put them into the chat. The chat I will be monitoring the chat the whole time. So if you have a question that's a burning question, you don't have to wait to the very end. Ask it right away, and then we can make the conversation a little more, or make tonight a little more conversational. So if you have a question, put it into the chat, and yeah, that should be it. All right, Brendan, take it away. Would you like to share your screen and show us your all your amazing research you're up to?
Definitely. Thank you. Let's see. How does that look?
It's working on it. There it is. Got it.
Perfect. I'll just minimize this Zoom stuff. All righty. Well, thank you very much. It's great to be here. Thanks for coming. Thanks to Save Our Seas Foundation and the museum, as well as Lance, of course, for hosting tonight. Today, I'm going to share a bit about what I've learned about the silky shark. And most of what I focus on is meant to be management relevant. So I'll try to weave in why, from a conservation or management perspective, we've been doing what we've been doing over the last few years, and hopefully why it's important. Before we get to that, let's meet the silky shark itself. I first fell in love with this species back around 2014, 2015 or so. I was doing a bunch of research offshore in the Eastern Bahamas and deep blue water like this, out in the open ocean. And sometimes we're lucky enough to find objects out there at sea, stuff like marine debris, floating logs, weed lines, anything that provides structure in a largely structureless environment, and thus attracts all kinds of marine life like these silky sharks. And I started to spend time with them in the water. I introduced them to all of my students, became increasingly fascinated by these guys. Folks don't know a whole lot about them in certain parts of the world. And they're a wonderful blend of inquisitive and shy. They're bold yet cautious at the same time. And I think that's part of why they became my favorite shark so quickly. In many ways, it's hard to put them in any one box. They're incredibly flexible in life history, habitat associations, foraging ecology movements. They basically do whatever they want out on the high seas within reasonable limits. They're a jack of all trades of sorts. And anytime I meet a new species, I like to think about it in the context of the greater tree of life on Earth. And for scientists, the system we use to classify all of that life is taxonomy. So the silky shark is obviously an animal, of which there are around 9 million species. It's a chordate, about 81,000 species in that group. It's in the class Chondrichthyes, which includes all your cartilaginous fish, your sharks, your rays, and your chimeras. It's about 1,200, 1,300 of those species on Earth. And then we get down into shark categories. This is the order Carchariniformes, about 250 species in that group. And again, we're moving closer and closer towards the tips of those branches of the evolutionary tree as we go down this list. These guys are in the family Carcharinidae. There's about 60 species. These are your requiem sharks. And then they're in the genus Carcharinus, about 35 species in that genus. And you can distinguish silky sharks from other species in the genus in part by having this dorsal ridge, interdorsal ridge between the first and second dorsal fin. So some species in this genus have it and some species don't. So that's your first identifying feature for the silky shark. And of course, the species name is falciformis. Scientific name then is Carcharinus falciformis. And that comes from the Latin words falx and formis. I probably didn't pronounce those correctly, but it refers to the shape of the pectoral fins, which are scythe or sickle shaped. Silkies are also distinguishable from other ridgeback sharks using 3 features that have helped me a lot in the field over the years. The first one that I find most obvious is the shape of the second dorsal fin. So this is in silkies about twice as long as it is tall, and as they swim, this thing will actually bounce side to side over the flank of the animal. It's very unique to silky sharks. They also have a pretty unique first dorsal fin. It's small, it's rounded at the apex, it has a convex trailing edge. And so that's something to look for as well. If you still are not sure what species it is at that point, you can look to the origin of the first dorsal fin, which is just behind the free rear tip of the pectoral fins. These guys also have a really pointy face, very pointed snout, and strong countershading along the face as well, meaning lighter on the bottom, darker on top. Makes for a very beautiful shark. This is kind of the classic shark shape that I think most people think of out in the open ocean. You can find silky sharks all over the world in the tropics and subtropics. They really like warm weather. You don't find them anywhere that's too cold. And they basically live anywhere off the bottom. They're not benthic associated. So we refer to them as coastal pelagic, semi-pelagic, pelagic, or even oceanic. They can fit all these different categories. Mostly we'll find juvenile areas fall along the shelf edge, maybe more structure associated, whereas adults might be more offshore. This is really coming from fragmented evidence. Again, these guys live all across the world, and how they live in one place isn't necessarily how they live in another place. They can kind of do whatever they want. The only thing I would say with certainty is you don't find them in really shallow water. The shallowest you'd find them is maybe 50 meters deep. Let's say 30 meters deep, a little shallower, the shelf edge along island regions. They are typically considered an oceanic shark, and that places them in a group of oceanic sharks and rays that include oceanic whitetips and blue sharks, basically anything you'd find out in the open ocean. And these guys all share a common story in that they've been fished a whole lot over the years. In fact, since 1970, fishing pressure affecting this group of species has gone up by 18-fold. And in that time, their abundance has unfortunately gone down by about 71%. Now, that's largely due to the fact that oceanic sharks co-occur with commercial targets, things like mahi and billfish and tuna, all the stuff that we like to eat. And as a result, they end up getting caught as bycatch, meaning they get caught accidentally. They'll get caught in purse seines, longline fisheries, even gillnet fisheries in the tropics and subtropics. And the silky shark tends to lead shark bycatch in many of those fisheries. They get caught from the shelf edge to far offshore, from small-scale artisanal fleets to large-scale industrial fleets. And because they're caught so often, there's an obvious need to manage their interactions with fisheries, many of which have actually mandated their live release. It's often a requirement that you have to throw them back after you catch them in a commercial capture scenario. But unfortunately, live release may not necessarily prevent mortality if they're dead at the boat the first time a fisherman sees them, which we refer to as at-vessel mortality, or if they die after being released alive, which we refer to as post-release mortality. And I'll give you a couple examples of how that can be pretty high for this species. First is on long lines in the Atlantic Ocean, where silky shark at-vessel mortality is over 50%. And even those animals that survive the capture event and then get tossed back, they might die afterwards from that post-release mortality. And you may have noticed on this photo, actually, a couple slides ago, that each of these sharks has fishing gear attached to its mouth. And there's some great work that actually shows that trailing fishing gear can increase the likelihood of post-release mortality even after they're thrown back in pretty decent shape. Now, post-release mortality is particularly high in tuna purse seine fisheries, where it can reach 95%. That makes sense. These are giant nets that scoop up big schools of tuna, including all the other species that hang out with the tuna, which are often silky sharks, and then they get compressed by an immense amount of weight as they're scooped up and onto the boat. So it's not uncommon for them to suffer post-release mortality due to the physical trauma as well as physiological insults that they accumulate throughout that capture and release event. They're also caught intentionally in some cases, and their meat and fins are consumed. They're actually the second most common shark species in Hong Kong shark fin markets, as you can see here, where silkies are second only to the blue shark in terms of the relative proportion of identified fins in these samples. Now, interestingly, nearly all the silky shark fins came from the Indo-Pacific, and almost none came from the Atlantic, suggesting that the main threat to silkies in the Atlantic is probably bycatch. In the Indo-Pacific, the fin trade also threatens this species. So it should be no surprise then their abundance globally has gone down quite significantly over the last 3 generations, estimated at about 50% at the global level, but that can be much higher in some places and much lower in others. It all depends. Thankfully, it's not all bad news for the silky shark. They do have a moderate intrinsic rebound potential relative to other sharks. In other words, they have a moderate ability to recover from fishing pressure, and that's largely based on their life history traits. They can mature at over 200 centimeters total length, corresponds to about 5 to 10 years old. They can live over 20 years. I think the oldest documented shark where longevity has actually been measured is 28 years, and they have a litter size of 1 to 16 pups. So to put that into context, I say moderate intrinsic rebound potential relative to other sharks because a shark with a much slower or much lower intrinsic rebound potential might have 1 or 2 pups every 2 years. So these guys can recover from fishing pressure pretty well if they're given the chance, and that's really good news for them. Of course, there's a lot of variability in the life history parameters for this species. Again, you do find it all over the world, and so it has a bit of variability depending on where you look. Hopefully this at least introduces you to this really cool large-bodied shark, ultimately based on evidence of declines in abundance, their life history, as well as the existence of ongoing threats, namely fishing. They were assessed as vulnerable with a decreasing population trend in the most recent IUCN Red List assessments. Now, most fisheries management organizations and governments, they don't implement their fisheries policy according to these designations. They instead opt to lean on stock assessment results, these being the backbone of sustainable fisheries management, according to the U.S. Fishery Management Agency, which is called NOAA. And it's important here that we take a second and define what a stock is. It's a population unit that has some integrity in space and time. So they're independent enough that changes in one won't necessarily affect changes in another. So a lot of fishing mortality, for example, on one stock shouldn't change the abundance of the fish in the other stock. And so the assessment of stocks then can be quite helpful. They provide designations of the stock being overfished or not, with overfishing occurring or not, as well as produce estimates of population size, mortality, and maximum sustainable yield. These pieces of information then provide the basis for conservation and management measures by RFMOs, which are called Regional Fisheries Management Organizations. Those are the organizations that manage fleets targeting tunas and tuna-like species, primarily on the high seas. And those are also the fleets we tend to think of as interacting most with silky sharks. These RFMOs manage huge swaths of ocean that are shown here on this map. Each color corresponds to each RFMO's convention area. And the ones we're interested in today are IATTC, it's in the Eastern Pacific, the Inter-American Tropical Tuna Commission, WCPFC, which is in the Western Central Pacific, and then ICAT, the International Commission for the Conservation of Atlantic Tunas, which is in the Atlantic. These are a mouthful. And these organizations have, for the last decade or so, focused on the silky shark as a species of conservation concern. In the Atlantic Ocean, no stock assessment has actually been attempted due to data limitations. In the Pacific, though, a stock assessment has been conducted, but there was low confidence in the model outputs. It did indicate, however, that biomass had declined and fishing mortality had increased in recent decades. In both of these ocean basins, the Atlantic and the Pacific, these RFMOs highlighted movement data as a very important yet missing piece to the management puzzle, in particular to help resolve stock structure. And of course, stock assessments require stock definitions. In order to do a stock assessment and put management in place, you have to delineate the stocks. You have to draw boundaries around those population units. And movement data can feed into that process. The movements of individuals can lead to reproductive mixing or genetic isolation between subpopulations, or they can result in animals being in the same place at the same time and then getting caught by the same fisheries. And so these movements, if they're well characterized, can help managers align the spatial scale of management with the spatial scale of the stocks.
Brendan, do you mind if I ask a question really quick about that?
Of course.
So you were talking about the silky shark and being a pelagic species, right? So with this idea of a stock, right? Stock, I would assume, would be geographically defined or not. I don't know. I guess that's the first question. Are they?
Ideally, you can draw it on a map. Yeah.
Yeah.
That would be the goal.
So I guess my follow-up question then is, how do you, with such a highly mobile pelagic species, how do you define stocks geographically if the sharks are moving across the ocean in large areas, or do they not?
Yeah.
Do we know that? Do silky sharks stay in a open pelagic area, but in a certain geographic or a certain region? Do they swim all over? Like blue
Right.
sharks, for example, will migrate all over the Atlantic Ocean, but do silkies do the same?
That is a really great question, and I'm hoping that the rest of the slides answer it pretty well.
I'm jumping the gun.
Yeah, that is the question though, is how do you do this? Basically, the short answer is you need data on movements, and you need genetic data as well. You need to get all the measurements you can of what parts of the ocean are connected by these animals, so you can
Right.
draw a map, draw a border.
Yeah, I have some other questions. We'll wait to the end about the tuna fishing. I
Okay.
find it really interesting that a lot of times these stock assessments, as you're saying, are being assessed by the tuna fishery.
Yep.
That's good, I guess. Question mark that they're concerned, right?
Definitely. Yeah. They're managing the fleets that are targeting tunas and tuna-like species. And there are a few different shark species, namely blue sharks, oceanic whitetips, and silkies that are the primary shark bycatch species that are, of particular conservation concern, at least that you find at the global level, that all these RFMOs have to deal with.
Yeah.
So yeah, when they can, they focus as much as they can on assessing those stocks as well through their bycatch committees, essentially, that are tasked with handling the bycatch species.
Okay. Fantastic. Thank you.
Cool. Of course. Also, can you hear my dog? She was whining. I can kick her out. Did you hear her at all?
Such is life. No,
All right.
I did not.
Cool.
Thanks, though.
She doesn't like what I'm saying, apparently. Okay, so tagging data, in answer to your question, is one of the best ways to get data on these movements and then ultimately draw those borders. In particular, satellite tag data. It's been useful in delineating these stocks, designating essential fish habitat as well, like identifying nursery grounds, accurately assessing patterns in catch and abundance, and reducing bycatch, among other things, by trying to separate fisheries and bycatch species out in space and time. Again, you have to know where they're at. And so I'm going to provide an example now of how movement data, in concert with other information, can inform the management of silky sharks in the Pacific. And this is some of the work that I'm doing this year during my postdoc at Scripps and the Nature Conservancy here in San Diego. So remember, in the Pacific, a stock assessment has been attempted, but there was low confidence in the model outputs. And a key piece of information that'll improve confidence in those outputs is a good estimate of how much movement occurs between the eastern and western sides of the Pacific Ocean. In other words, how much mixing occurs between these regions that are managed by these two different RFMOs. And thankfully, there are lots of tag data available for this region, coming from tags deployed on 244 individuals going all the way back to 1967. But they're coming from 9 different studies. So no one had ever considered all this movement data together in one place before. And that's one of the steps that we've taken this year as we try to get a handle on stock structure in the Pacific. And it's really helpful just to visualize these kinds of things. And so we've put it all on this map here, and I'll introduce you. There are a bunch of parts. So we'll start with these dashed black lines. They represent the northern and southern limits of the silky shark range in the Pacific. Remember, they like warm water, so they're not going into those high latitudes. And then I've got the management areas identified by the dashed lines running north and south, with IATTC on the right side of the screen to the east and WCPFC as the management organization to the left, to the west. Each blue dot represents a silky shark tagging location. Red dots indicate the tag pop-offs or the furthest displacement that we know of from the tracks that were developed. And then the white lines just connect those 2 points for each individual. So just an aside here, these data represent an enormous amount of work accomplished by tons of researchers, some of whom are listed on the bottom of the screen. We obviously couldn't take this bird's eye view without their immense contributions in this field over decades. And so we'll now just try to interpret all of these data together, see what we can pull out of it.
So just to clarify, so the white lines are just showing you where a beginning and an end, right? It's not like the shark swam in a direct line from one place to another, right?
Exactly. So these are basically saying, okay, if you have a track of an animal in the Pacific, what are the furthest 2 points that you can identify in that track to say, an animal in Mexico on occasion might be found in Hawaii? Does that?
Yeah, so I can see how this helps with stock assessment, right? With that geographic kind of mapping of barriers, if you will. And then,
Yeah, hopefully.
do those trackers give you a sense of time scale on between point A and point B?
They do. Yeah, they have a clock on board, and so you know the date of deployment and you know the date of the final transmission as well,
Okay.
as well as the date of each estimated location.
Right. So you can get a determination of how fast they're moving too, right?
Definitely. Yeah, you can estimate swimming speed per day.
That's cool.
Yeah, you can't do it at a really fine scale, but yeah, certainly per day based on the track. Yeah, great question. So you probably already noticed by looking at this map, there's some indication of connectivity between the island chains on the western half of the screen, but clearly there's no movement between the western and eastern Pacific, right? So let's just briefly consider what it would take for that to happen. And it's important to consider here that silky sharks, in my mind, are quite structure associated in general. So a silky shark would need to move about 4,600 kilometers across pure open ocean habitat, very deep open ocean habitat from Cabo in Mexico to Hawaii to get from one shelf edge or island chain to another and cross that management boundary in the middle. The largest documented movement for a silky anywhere on Earth is 3,500 kilometers. That was in the Indian Ocean, where it moved across open ocean habitats, but it also visited island and seamount kind of stepping stones along the way. That was going from the Chagos Archipelago to East Africa. So movement data, at least at this point in the Pacific, don't support any connection between the Western and Eastern Pacific. We can then pull in genetic data as well and see how these animals are mixing reproductively across the region. And genetic data agree with what we're seeing in the movement data. They suggest 5 stocks: Taiwan, Papua New Guinea, South Pacific, North Pacific, and Eastern Pacific. So that says that even if they're sharing some space, like on the left half of the screen, they're not reproducing with animals across those boundaries. They aren't sharing their DNA. And so that also suggests that movements between the Eastern and Western Pacific are probably quite rare. So hopefully this knowledge can inform the next stock assessment in the Pacific and improve model confidence. Now we're going to jump to the Atlantic now. And in doing so, we're going to take we're going to move backwards in time, in a sense, because silky shark research is way behind where it is in the Pacific. Remember, there's no stock assessment in the Atlantic. In fact, we don't have much information on where silky sharks are going in this region at all. So this whole exercise we just did of putting everything on one map, it hasn't really been possible in the Western Atlantic Ocean, at least not with really robust data. And so when I was based at the Bahamas and South Florida for my PhD at FIU and the Cape Eleuthera Institute, I set out with a huge network of collaborators to collect horizontal and vertical movement data for silkies in the Western North Atlantic Ocean. And we did that in collaboration with the RFMO for the Atlantic, again, is ICAT, and the US Management Agency, which is NOAA. And so I started that journey first by reviewing all the known movements of silkies in the Western Atlantic, similar to what we did in the Pacific, but could only draw on so much. It may seem comprehensive, but it really isn't. The data I'll show you in the next couple slides, it's quite regional. It's from a small portion of the Western Atlantic, and the tag data are almost entirely from conventional tags that look a lot like this. And these things provide only 2 locations: 1, where the tag is deployed, and 2, where an animal is recaptured by another fisherman, and then the tag is read. So it's not to understate the utility of this data set. This conventional tagging data set maintained by NOAA Fisheries spans 50 plus years. It's a great source of information. And within it, there are 65 tag recapture events for silkies. You can see that on this map. This is probably familiar. This is the East Coast. You guys are based in Miami. Each of these arrows has got a capture point at the start and a recapture point at the end. So this is the only information we have. We have the start and end, these 2 different dates. We have no idea what was happening in between. We also don't know what was happening in terms of depth use. And so this offers some useful information. We know that there's movement up and down the East Coast. At least it's possible. It does occur. There's movement across the Gulf of Mexico and even from the South Atlantic Bight to the Southern Gulf. The largest documented movement is 1,339 kilometers. The only satellite tag data, though, which provides more complete information, comes from the southern coast of Cuba. And here there were just a few tags deployed on silkies that suggested some degree of residency. These shapes represent all the known locations of these sharks over about a 30-day period. But obviously, these sharks didn't move far from the tagging location. Sample size was small. Deployment durations were quite short. And so we wanted to put out more tags for longer periods all over the region and build on all of this past work, moving towards something like what we've been developing in the Pacific Ocean based on years and years of work. So we're just at the initial stage of that in the Western Atlantic. Eventually, we successfully deployed 61 tags across this region, again, with a huge network of collaborators. The first tags were actually deployed in 2002, and we still have tags in the water right now on silkies in the Gulf of Mexico. And that was on animals ranging from 118 centimeters, which is probably about the size of the silky shark in that photo, to about 300 centimeters, really big adults. Over half of them were immature, over half were female. Ultimately, we collected a ton of data, well over 100,000 data points from this effort. The majority of our data came from pop-up archival satellite tags. We call them PSATs for short, and they collect light level, depth, and temperature information, and then they store it until a predetermined pop-off date. So you attach it to the shark, collects all that information, it pops off when, hopefully, when you tell it to, floats to the surface, and then transmits all the data on board to a satellite array, and you can download it through the internet. Some of our data came from spot tags as well. These are smart position only tags. They transmit real-time locations whenever that antenna breaks the surface of the water. And we deploy these tags on silky sharks in a few different ways. For the PSATs, we use dart or umbrella tags and place them straight into the dorsal musculature, just like this in the Eastern Bahamas. We can also attach using a bridle, and that goes through the first dorsal fin. You may notice this isn't a silky shark. That fin doesn't have any of those primary characteristics that I mentioned earlier. This is actually a Caribbean reef shark, but it demonstrates that tag attachment method really nicely. And you actually notice that yellow tag right below the green, that's a conventional tag, just has a number, an animal number, and a phone number, so people can report recaptures when they get them.
Brendan, I gotta ask:
Yeah.
does that bother the shark having their dorsal fin tagged like that?
Hard to say. It definitely causes some injury. You know, I'm not aware of any evidence that shows that their risk of mortality goes up because of the tag. But certainly there's some physical injury that happens. Basically, that bridle, as the animal swims, is exerting drag on the animal, and so it migrates back through the fin until it falls out. Now, I've seen that on Caribbean reef sharks like this, where, you know, at different points in that migration, basically you can see the fin healing in front of it. So by the time the tag falls out, the fin is completely healed, and maybe there's a little scarring there, but the shark is in great shape. It's growing the whole time. It's able to feed, etc. And the fin heals. So I've seen that. These other tag attachments, these ones, I don't prefer to use these because I find that they are easier to pull out. Silky sharks do like structure. We think that they rub these tags off on different things. We've seen footage of them scraping along whale sharks, for example, in the Pacific. And so I'm sure they do that, you know, on anything they can find. It's probably irritating, and they probably try to shake it off, and they're pretty successful. A lot of tag deployments are cut short. So yeah, I prefer these tags. You know, it's a slightly more invasive method, I think, in my opinion. But at the same time, it offers better tag retention and gives you really valuable data.
It's interesting.
And the third type of attachment is for the spot tag, and this is similar. You have to drill small holes in the first dorsal fin, but that's to get the spot tag up near the top of the fin, so the antenna is really high up. So when the shark is at the surface, it breaks the surface of the water and can transmit to satellites, and you get that real-time timestamp location of where the shark is on Earth. All right, so I'm going to take a slight detour here for a second because I mentioned we were collecting vertical movement information for silkies as well as horizontal movements, and it's pretty important. Now, it's very messy when you look at it at first. It's giving us information again on depth and temperature, and so it's pretty noisy. It's really helpful to distill it all down across all sharks and really simply just look at where they're spending their time in the water column, and hopefully I'll demonstrate how that can inform management and conservation as well. And so we do that by creating these time at depth plots where you've got percent records for all silky sharks with PSATs attached on the x-axis going from 0 to 50%. And then on the y-axis, you've got depth going from the sea surface at 0 at the top to 500 meters on the bottom. And I've split this into 25-meter depth bins to get a sense of where they're hanging out. So they're spending most of their time quite shallow, mean depth of 41 meters. 93% of the time cumulatively of all these silky sharks is spent shallower than 100 meters. Occasionally they'll make a deep dive down almost 500 meters deep. We'll look at the same plot now, but for temperature, and it's going to correspond to the depth use, right? They're spending time really shallow where it's really sunny. There's a lot of light. It's quite warm. It's in the upper mix layer. And so, of course, they're going to experience the warmest water temperatures that are really available in the places where they hang out. And so mean temperature of 25, 26 degrees C, vast majority of time between 22 and 30 degrees C. And then occasionally when they make those deep dives, they experience some really cold temperatures like 8 or 9 C. Now, these depth and temperature profiles unfortunately mean that silky sharks are spending their time at the same depths as many species that are targeted by shallow set gears. You have vertical overlap between the target species, silky sharks, and longlines, for example, that might be targeting tuna or mahi. And so if you're fishing the top 200 meters, you can expect to catch silky sharks. That's where they occur. Silky sharks are pretty vulnerable to capture as a result. If you wanted to reduce that vulnerability, you could potentially fish deeper. You could set those hooks or the nets lower than where the silkies hang out. I'd say below 100 meters, even below 200 meters. We've seen that successfully reduce bycatch in some fisheries, not for silkies, but for other sharks. So it is an option. The catch, of course, is whether you can retain your target catch while reducing bycatch. We're going to shift back to horizontal movements now. We'll just consider these movements of silkies, the 61 silky sharks in the Western Atlantic. I've got green stars here representing tag deployment locations, red stars representing tag pop-offs. Again, the arrows represent just the simple linear movements between those 2 points. These tags are from every manufacturer available. The data are really messy and have to be handled differently, so I'm not going to get into the details of any of that. We'll just focus on some of the most interesting tracks that we've seen thus far. And so here they are. These are the most likely tracks that we've generated using standard techniques for processing SATAG data. You'll notice instead of just the deployment and pop-off locations, we now have the actual movements of the sharks while the tag is on their back on this map. And so the maximum likelihood locations show up as little black dots, and then the different color lines correspond to each animal of interest and just connect those points. And so we get an idea of where it was going while the tag was deployed. I know there's a lot going on here. This is a really big region. And so we'll just break it down and zoom in on some of the most interesting places. So we got to go to the Bahamas first. That's where I spent basically most of my 20s. I love it in the Bahamas. And we tagged a handful of silky sharks down there. Interestingly, none of them left the Bahamas. They all exhibited local movements. They stayed within the country, particularly the ones in the eastern Bahamas around San Salvador. It's this beautiful island where there's a chain of seamounts in that kind of half moon shape running north-south. And that probably provides really valuable foraging opportunities. So it's no surprise that the silkies hang out there. We know from different work all over the world that silky sharks really love seamounts, probably to have better access to food than they would in the true open ocean.
Brendan, would you mind just defining what a seamount is for us real quick?
Yeah, a seamount is basically if you think of like a mountain range, right? If you're coming across Kansas and suddenly you see a mountain in the distance, you're probably going to go to it. That's how I think of it. A silky shark is going to do the same thing. They're out in a barren landscape, barren seascape, I guess. It's completely structureless, at least to the naked eye. And so if you can find something that gives you some reference point where the currents are mixing things around really nicely, it's going to attract different types of food. It may provide some shelter as well if you're a small silky shark like these guys are for these tracks. And so it's going to be a meeting point is how I think of it.
Okay, cool. So it's like an underwater mountain. So it doesn't
Exactly.
quite reach the surface to make an island.
Exactly. Yeah.
Okay, cool.
Yeah. And these ones in off San Salvador, the top of them is pretty shallow. We're talking like 100, 200 feet down. You reach the top of that seamountain and then it drops off really steep on either side. Yeah. That's the Bahamas. We're going to jump over to the northern Gulf of Mexico now. We again find some evidence for localized movements along the shelf edge and canyons off of Louisiana and Florida. Unfortunately, many of our tag deployments in this area were pretty short. Silkies might have ripped their tags off on oil rigs. Remember, I mentioned they love to scratch on structure. So we think, and these oil rigs are really cool. They're out, at least ecologically, they attract a lot of diversity. And the silky shark abundance I've seen at these oil rigs is higher than anywhere else I've been. These things are in 200, 300, 400 meters of water, and there's this complex latticework structure going from the seafloor all the way up to the surface. And so at the surface, especially around early morning, you put some bait in the water and you might have 50 silky sharks that swarm the back of the boat, more than I've seen anywhere else. So pretty cool. We tagged a handful of sharks there. This is actually where we have 2 more sharks with tags right now swimming in the water. So hopefully we get good data from those and they don't release early. We'll also take a look at some movements off of the east coast of Florida. It's always fascinating stuff going on in Florida. It's no different for the sharks. We'll focus first on 4 silky sharks tagged off of Jupiter at that green star there, not far from you guys in Miami. These are all large males. They all moved long distances and tag durations were really good. And 3 of them, interestingly, moved between the US, the Bahamas, and Cuba. And they did that by following the shelf edge as water started to cool in the fall, and then they moved back up north along the shelf edge as water started to warm in the mid-springtime. And so this suggests they're going through a minor climactic migration. They're chasing warmer temperatures, moving south as it gets into winter. But they have some obvious management implications, these movements. There's no fishing for sharks in the Bahamian exclusive economic zone, basically within Bahamian borders. It's a shark sanctuary. Longlining is also prohibited. And then in the US, there's a pelagic longline closed area off the east coast of Florida, so they're safe there from at least that type of fishing. But down in the Cuban jurisdiction, there are longline fisheries, and they both target and retain sharks when they're caught as bycatch. And we've seen from some great work there that catch rates of silky sharks increase in wintertime. And that corresponds to the silkies that we're tracking, moving south from the US and Bahamian waters down into Cuban waters in winter. So, of course, this means that there has to be collaborative management of silky sharks across these boundaries. Fish don't respect international borders. They're chasing more important things like food and shelter and mating opportunities. And that's what the silky sharks are doing here. So, of course, there has to be some cooperation between the US, Bahamian, and Cuban fisheries management agencies in order to manage the species. The final 2 tracks that I'll focus on in this region are both from spot tags. They were deployed on large mature females over 230 centimeters total length. One in orange there comes from just 91 days, but it shows this directed movement from South Florida up to New England to some seamounts where it's, again, probably feeding. And hopefully that answers your question, Lance. That's what a seamount looks like. You can see it's a nice underwater mountain range. Cool. So that's an image of the bathymetry where you can see the elevation. The other in crimson is from a nearly year-long journey, going from Jupiter all the way up into the northern Gulf and then back to Jupiter by the next summer. And so I'm very curious to know what brings this shark and others. I think at this point we've had 5 to 10 silkies tagged in Jupiter one summer and seen there again the next summer. I'm curious what's going on. Why are they coming back and exhibiting this site fidelity, maybe some seasonal residency there in summer? We would expect in summer mating season to begin, but we haven't seen any evidence of mating through bite wounds on any of the mature females. When sharks go through mating behaviors, the males will actually bite the females, and you can see evidence of that, of the mating behavior in aggregations. Here we haven't seen it yet. Maybe it's happening, maybe not. Maybe they're there to feed. We don't know. But it's obviously a very important place for silky sharks. I haven't seen aggregations of adults like we have off of Jupiter anywhere else that we've done work in the Western North Atlantic. So really, you guys down in Miami, you have an incredible opportunity to go out with some of those dive operators up there and spend time with these silkies in the water in summertime. I really recommend it. They're amazing, amazing animals. And so let's go ahead and just put all these movements in the Atlantic now into the wider context of stock delineation and management again. Let's first consider how management occurs currently by ICAT, that regional tuna fishery management organization. They just use the equator as a semi-arbitrary delineation between northern and southern stocks. But genetic data that's coming from this region indicate that there are at least 3 stocks, one in the Gulf of Mexico, one on the other side of Florida in the Atlantic, and then one south of the equator as well. Now, our movement data can't offer any conclusive evidence of what's going on here, of which stock structure we recommend. We can say, though, that the movements support at least a 2-stock approach. We didn't have animals get tagged off of Jupiter that go down to southern Brazil, or from the Bahamas, or even from our southernmost deployments that I didn't get into, but from Belize. All the animals that we tagged stayed within the general region. Hopefully, as we analyze more tagged tracks, we can get a better sense of how much mixing actually occurs between the Gulf of Mexico and the east coast of Florida with animals that travel up and around the shelf edge there. I'm going to go ahead and wrap this up with a couple slides Overall, I would say silky sharks are more structure associated than I thought, that I think most people thought prior to this work coming together. They love the shelf edge environment. They love seamounts. They love floating objects, even if they're out on the high seas. All signs, genetic and movement data point towards more localized movements, higher residency, and greater population structure than I think we anticipated. These guys actually resemble more of a shelf-associated shark than they do a true pelagic open ocean shark. And importantly, what this says to me is that the main source of fishing mortality for this species is unlikely to be from those offshore industrial fleets. And preliminary data from the Eastern Pacific actually agree. From longline and purse seine fleets, those large-scale fleets, they're catching up to 5,000 tons of silky sharks per year. But then we look at the small scale coastal fleets from Mexico to Ecuador, and they're catching between 10,000 and 14,000 tons per year. So moving forward, the key to managing silky sharks may well be to better account for these shelf edge associated fisheries and seamount associated fisheries that operate in habitats where silkies are probably more abundant and may spend more time than they do offshore. So I'm going to go ahead and leave it there. I want to thank, there's so many people who have contributed to this, students, collaborators. We've shared so many monotonous days on the boat catching absolutely nothing, and then sometimes there's like 50 silkies at the boat before you've even brushed your teeth in the morning. I also want to give a special shout out to Vital from Saving the Blue. He's been working with me on the spot tag data analysis in recent weeks. So it's really great to chip away at a large project like this piece by piece as a big collaborative network. I also, of course, have to thank all the groups who have sponsored us through logistical support and financial support. Again, far too many to note, but special thanks to Save Our Seas, of course, given the context of this talk. None of this can be accomplished without working together. Thank you. And with that, I'm happy to take any questions.
That's some beautiful imagery you have of this such a beautiful species of shark. It's such a, I think you're totally right. And like when you picture a shark, this is the quintessential shark that comes to mind, right? It's really cool.
Yeah, I love them.
We can tell. At least I can tell. Well, we had a few questions come in from the audience from various times, but and then I have some follow-up questions for you as well, just my general interest. But one of the questions, I think it goes back to some of that Pacific data. If you don't mind, I'll stop sharing here. Some of the Pacific data that you had and been a part of. Do you notice that the sharks, this is from one of our guests, do any of the sharks avoid certain events like hurricanes or cyclones or earthquake prone areas? Have you been able to overlay any of that data with their movement?
Good question. I'm not aware of any studies that have looked at how those types of events affect silky shark movements in particular. Some of the best data on the effects of hurricanes, for example, come from South Florida, where there are long-term studies where sharks like bull sharks that are hanging out around the coast are tracked like across maybe 2 years. And then you can see, all right, what happens during that week when a big hurricane comes through, and you can see them move off into deeper water and, get out of those environments that are probably full of debris. They're probably becoming very fresh, right? The salinity is going to go down, become very turbid. So it makes sense that they'll move out of those habitats. For silky sharks that are a bit deeper, I'm not aware of any studies that really identify what it is they're doing.
They're deep enough to not really care so much that the hurricane's overhead.
Yeah, I think in one sense, definitely. There's, we have to think about the open ocean at the same time as it's a featureless environment to the naked eye, but it is structured not only by things like seamounts, but also by we call them mesoscale processes, things like eddies. So you think of a current that's, if a lot of people familiar with the Gulf Stream, right, off the East Coast. And so the Gulf Stream comes up around Florida and then loops out into the middle of the Atlantic. And as it does that, there are little vortices that spin off of it, right? And so those create little pockets of water that'll be either a little colder or a little warmer than the surroundings. The same thing can happen with hurricanes as the pressure in the air changes and water can, the sea surface height can change. The ocean surface can actually bulge upward or kind of compress downwards, depending on various conditions. And so all of those features would affect something like a silky shark, where they'd be
Okay.
drawn to those places that structure their open, featureless environment,
Right.
and would attract prey to those spots as well. So they'd have better
Right.
foraging opportunities at the edges of those boundaries.
That's really interesting. Um, Another question that came in from the audience was about the Jupiter, the tracking data. Where I guess where did those tags, were they far offshore? Were they in deeper water? Or were they more? I guess they weren't coastal, right? You said the silky sharks don't really come in close to Jupiter. So would there be any land-based features such as rivers or anything that would impact, I guess, maybe through these structures, as you've said them, like the eddies and things like that, changes in salinity might have some sort of effect. So the question was, are there any land-based things that might affect them, why they're coming back? The females come back to have their young there, or something, just
Yeah, it's a great question. We're not sure, and we don't know why they
yeah.
come back to Jupiter. Um, if you look at the bathymetry, the bottom contours of the shelf edge there, it's there's a pretty wide, well, how do I say this accurately? It's you've got the Straits of Florida coming up. It's very deep water, and the shelf edge is pretty steep down by the Keys. You come up by Miami and get up to Jupiter, and that shelf edge isn't as sharp, but it
Okay.
comes in quite close, and you get some ledges where you're dropping from, let's say, 100 feet to maybe more like 150, 200 feet. And
Right.
so those little breaks are places where you can go find silky sharks and other more oceanic species, as they're
Okay.
typically known, will come to those spots. So it's not far. You can see land. You're not far offshore,
Right.
but you're in water that's 30, 40 meters deep, 100 feet.
Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting. I've and just my own personal experience, I've noticed, anecdotally, that there are a lot more sharks in Jupiter. Just in the Gulf Stream comes a little bit closer there,
Yeah,
um, closer to the land. So it could just be, something related to that. It's interesting.
definitely.
Um, do you know, well, we've had a few speakers that have come on to the series last year and this year as well, and have talked a little bit about environmental genetics. So environmental genetics, I'm sure you know what this is, but for our audience, it's whenever we take samples from the water, and we analyze the water for genetic material, DNA, if you will, right? That's contained in the water, and we can classify that to say that this animal, this species, has been present in this area, right?
Yep.
Has that approach ever been thought about with silky sharks, to do some environmental genetics to see where they are, when, and this kind of thing?
A great question. Yeah, it's becoming increasingly popular as a technique to answer all kinds of questions. For silky shark specifically, I don't know that it's been used yet.
Would it be useful?
Yeah.
I don't know. I mean, with such, I don't know how good of a data you would get with the current things that would drift through the area, right? The Gulf Stream current is quite fast, so genetic data in the water there could be from a large area. But I don't know. I'm just thinking as you were talking and defining stocks, right? So if you had a genetic marker for a certain stock, could you use that to help you further delineate stocks and things?
Yeah, it's a great idea. I'm not a geneticist, so what I'm about to say could be completely wrong. My guess, usually those, we call it eDNA. The eDNA studies are typically looking for presence absence of species. I I'm not aware of any that have yet used eDNA to actually look at the genetic makeup of the samples within it, if that makes sense. So
Okay.
if you're looking
Yeah,
at
yeah.
population genetic structure, you're going to have, well, what folks have done in the past is take samples from individual sharks. So you take a small piece of a fin, for example,
Right.
and you use that to figure out the sequences of DNA for that specific shark. And then you can compare that to similar sequences in another shark somewhere else on Earth. I know from the eDNA work that it's more presence absence. It's more like, is there a silky shark here or not?
Right.
And so it's not so much figuring out whether they're from the same stock and whether they're
Mm,
reproducing together and sharing alleles or not.
right.
And I don't know if our molecular techniques are quite there yet. I'd assume that the DNA that's just drifting around in the water column is not in good enough shape to do that kind of detailed analysis, but
Yeah.
I'll probably be proved wrong.
Well, with time, we all are, right?
Yeah. I lean towards I like to be hands-on and I like to see stuff very visual. So
Yeah.
all that kind of thing. I'm always like, I don't know. Maybe someday.
Well, let's bring it back to you just a little bit. We like to highlight the speaker and learn a little bit about how you got involved into studying what you're studying. We have maybe like 4 minutes left for 5 minutes left for a few more little questions, but I
Okay.
wanted just to know, like, if someone's watching this evening and wants to learn more about how to become a shark biologist, how could they follow in your footsteps? What could be some advice that you might give them, something that you've learned in your journey in becoming a shark biologist?
That's a great question. I think something I always recommend is just to get as involved as possible as early as possible. It's such a competitive field. And there are so many people who, at least, pretty young, want to do this kind of thing, want to do marine biology, and specifically want to study sharks or want to study whales. And so it gets really, really competitive. And to stand out, you do need to have some good experience. Take the right classes, have the right transcripts. Degree in biology, ecology, natural resource management, all that kind of stuff is great. The more opportunities to get out in the field, at least for the type of work that I've done, the better. Of course, having a solid ability to write and to analyze data is a huge advantage as well. So, it's having a lot of tools in the toolbox. And the only way that you get those is by starting really early in your career and just starting to accumulate those skills.
Very, very cool. Yeah, that's great advice. Kind of follow your passion, right? And dive head first, right?
Definitely.
Um,
And say yes to things. Yeah.
yes, there you
Go do
go.
stuff.
You want to
I
go
was,
on to do some research? Yes.
yeah. As an example, just briefly, I was, although I knew I was hopefully going to become a marine biologist at some point, I spent quite a bit of my undergraduate years out in the desert studying other stuff, terrestrial mammals. So,
Mhm.
I found a lot of those skills even translated. A lot of the questions that were being asked about mountain lions and how they affect, prey landscapes in New Mexico, those same questions are questions we're asking about sharks in the ocean. So yeah, just being open to different opportunities and building up that skill set.
Yeah, because those skills could transfer. That's a
Yep.
good point. Just one last question for you before we sign off for tonight. How can a member of the general public, how could they get involved? How could they help conserve silky sharks and others? We talked about fishing. Is sustainable fishing an avenue, how to help protect these species? So just in general, how can we get involved? How can we help? How can we protect silky sharks and other pelagic species?
Yeah, I mean, at the most basic level, I would say with any kind of fisheries related question, it comes down to seafood, and a big part of it is going to come from consumer choices. And so at the individual level, being aware of where you're getting your fish. Generally, I suggest to people, if you want to buy seafood, buy U.S. wild caught. Generally, that's a safe bet. The U.S. manages its fisheries as well or better than anywhere else on Earth.
Mhm.
If you're interested in eating tuna, you can get it at your local dock in a place like Miami or here in San Diego. That's going to have very little bycatch associated with it. If you're buying it at the supermarket, you can get pole caught tuna. That's tuna that's not going to come from a long line or purse seine fishery where something like a
Mhm.
silky shark is going to get caught.
They catch it
And
with a fishing pole, in other words.
yeah, with a
Yeah.
fishing pole. Yeah, exactly. Then it's, one hook, one fish.
Mhm.
So no bycatch there. It's going to run a little more expensive than like the true industrial capture techniques. But you're paying for the increased care that goes into getting that food on your plate. So for me, that's the most obvious and immediate thing folks can do at the individual level. Beyond that, in terms of getting involved in research and conservation, again, I like to stay local. You know, there are different labs studying sharks and working on the conservation and management of sharks all over the country. So within the United States, I'd say in Miami, there are great labs at FIU in particular, at Nova, at UM as well, at Florida State, up in Tallahassee, University of North Florida. They're all over the place. And there are great researchers working at these institutions who constantly are seeking funding for students and looking for more opportunities to do more work that feeds directly into NOAA's management portfolio. And so, you know, I say support all those people that are probably in your backyard that are seeking funding all the time, and volunteers as well, if you want to get out on the boat.
Yeah, volunteering. I'm sure the need for volunteer help is pretty good
Always.
there too.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, awesome. Thank you very, very much for joining us tonight and sharing your research and sharing your passion for pelagic ocean, you know, sharks. It's really awesome when we get to connect with a scientist that's out there doing the work and helping to conserve sharks, you know, through research. This is how we do it. So thank you very much for your work. Thanks for sharing your knowledge tonight and joining us.
Of course. Yeah. Thank you so much for having me. Thanks for hosting the series.
Yes, of course. And for anyone that wants to join us next time, next month, we will have our next speaker series, October 5th, same time, 6 p.m. to 7 p.m. Eastern. This time we will be joined by postdoctoral student Emilio Garcia Rodriguez from the Center for Science Investigation and Higher Education in Baja California. He will be talking all about kelp, important ocean forests for sharks. So a little bit of Pacific shark action happening, learning all about kelp forests and the sharks associated with them. So we hope to see you then. Until then, thank you to the Save Our Seas Foundation. Thank you again, Brendan, for joining us. And we will see you next time. Thank you.
Of course. Thanks, Lance.